Hello, and welcome back to the Resilient Walk. If you've found your way here today, perhaps you're carrying something heavy. Maybe you're in a season where wisdom feels insufficient, where all the books you've read, all the advice you've gathered, all the understanding you've built, none of it seems to touch the ache that's settled deep in your chest. You're not alone in this feeling. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let's travel together to a place where the mountains touch the sky, where an ancient university sits perched on cliffs of stone, and where a young scholar is about to discover that sometimes the heart must break before it can truly understand. In the high mountains, where the air grows thin and thoughts seem to crystallize like frost, there stood a university older than memory. Its halls were carved from living stone, its libraries filled with the collected wisdom of 1,000 generations. Among its students was a young man named Kai. If you had seen him, you might have noticed how his shoulders curved slightly forward from years of bending over books. How his eyes carried the particular brightness of someone who believed that every question had an answer, every problem a solution if only you could find the right text. The perfect teaching, the precise understanding. Kai moved through those ancient halls like a man possessed by purpose. While other students gathered in courtyards to laugh and share stories, he remained in the library until the oil lamps burned low. The soft whisper of turning pages was his favorite sound. The weight of a new book in his hands felt like holding possibility itself. He had come to the university with a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy. Every morning, he would wake before dawn and ask himself, "What will I learn today? What wisdom will I gather?" The masters praised his dedication. His essays were quoted by professors. Other students sought his help with their studies. But if you had looked closely, really looked, you might have seen something else. A kind of desperate intensity in how he gripped his pen. A way his jaw tightened when a concept remained unclear. Kai wasn't just seeking knowledge. He was building armor out of understanding, constructing walls out of wisdom. You see, deep down, Kai believed that if he could just learn enough, understand enough, become wise enough, he would never have to feel helpless again. Never have to face a moment where all his preparation, all his studying, all his careful accumulation of insight would fail him. The universe, as it often does, was preparing a different lesson entirely. It was a Tuesday in late autumn when the letter arrived. Kai was in the library, as always, transcribing passages about the nature of impermanence and irony that would not be lost on him later. The messenger's footsteps echoed through the stone corridors like a countdown he didn't know he was hearing. The parchment felt ordinary in his hands. The words, at first, seemed to make no sense. They were common words, sick, quickly, gone, but arranged in a way that his mind couldn't quite process. Like trying to solve an equation where all the numbers had suddenly changed meaning. His father was dead. The young scholar who had memorized treatises on grief, who could recite 12 different philosophical approaches to loss, who had written eloquently about the impermanent nature of existence, sat frozen in his chair as the world rearranged itself around him. All his books, all his understanding, all his carefully constructed wisdom, it felt like trying to stop a mountain avalanche with a handful of pressed flowers. That night, Kai walked the halls like a ghost haunting his own life. His fellow students offered comfort, but their words felt like they were coming from very far away. The masters spoke of acceptance, of the natural order, of finding peace in understanding the greater pattern. But understanding felt like a cruel joke. What good was wisdom when your heart was breaking? What use was philosophy when every breath felt like swallowing glass? He had spent years building a fortress of knowledge, only to discover that grief was water. It found every crack, seeped through every defense, and filled the spaces he thought were protected. For 3 days, Kai couldn't open a single book. The sight of words on pages made him feel nauseous. All those hours of study, all that accumulated inside it, sat there like useless furniture, a house that had burned down around it. On the 4th morning, something inside him snapped, or perhaps broke open. He gathered his few belongings, left a note for his masters, and began walking toward the mountains. Not to seek answers, he was down with answers, but simply because he couldn't bear to be in a place where wisdom was supposed to matter, and his felt so utterly, completely worthless. The path up the mountain was rocky and unforgiving. Kai's soft scholar's hands quickly developed blisters. His lungs, accustomed to the musty air of libraries, burned in the thin mountain atmosphere. But he walked anyway, driven by something he couldn't name, a need to go somewhere his books couldn't follow. He found a small cave halfway up the peak, just large enough for one person to shelter. The floor was covered with a thin layer of sand that had blown in over centuries. A trickle of spring water ran down one wall. It was, in its way, perfect, a place where a broken heart could hide from the world. For the first week, Kai did nothing but sleep and cry. The tears came in waves, sometimes gentle like spring rain, sometimes violent like thunderstorms. He had never allowed himself to cry this way before. Scholars, after all, were supposed to understand their emotions, control them, contextualize them within greater frameworks of meaning. But here, with only the wind and stone as witnesses, he wept like the child he had never let himself be. And slowly, something began to change. Not healing, not yet, but a kind of emptiness that wasn't quite despair. Like a cup that has been completely drained and sits waiting, not knowing what it will be filled with next. It was during his 3rd week in the cave that Kai began to notice the water. The spring that trickled down the wall was tiny, barely more than a dampness that collected into droplets. But those droplets, over time, had carved a small channel in the stone. Not through force or violence, but through simple, persistent presence. He began to watch the water more closely. How it found the smallest crack in the rock and followed it. How it didn't fight the stone but worked with it, finding the path of least resistance, yet somehow reshaping everything it touched. One morning, as the early light filtered into the cave, Kai traced the water's path with his finger. The stone was smooth where the water had passed, not eroded, but polished, made beautiful, and something whispered in his mind, not a voice, exactly, but an understanding that arose like mist from deep places. The water doesn't break the stone. It reveals what was always there, sitting there in the half-light. Kai realized he had been thinking about wisdom all wrong. He had collected understanding like a merchant collects goods, something to possess, to use, to protect himself with. But wisdom, real wisdom, wasn't something you had. It was something you became. Through the slow, patient work of letting life reshape you. His father's death hadn't destroyed his wisdom. It had revealed where his wisdom was still shallow, still untested. The grief wasn't the opposite of understanding, it was understanding's deepest teacher, showing him truths that could only be learned in the valley of loss. The pain hadn't made him foolish, it had made him human. Beautifully, necessarily, completely human. For the first time since receiving that terrible letter, Kai felt something other than despair. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet recognition. Like seeing his own face in still water after a long journey and realizing he had become someone new. When Kai finally descended from the mountain, the other students barely recognized him. The desperate intensity was gone from his eyes, replaced by something deeper, a kind of stillness that came from having been emptied and refilled with something truer than knowledge. He returned to his studies, but everything was different now. Where once he had devoured books like a man afraid of starving, now he read like someone savoring a meal prepared by loving hands. He asked different questions, not how can I use this, but how can this help me understand the human heart? The other students began to seek him out, but for different reasons than before. Yes, he still knew the texts, still understood the theories. But now, when someone came to him with a problem, he didn't immediately reach for a book. He reached first for their experience, their pain, their confusion, and met it with the part of himself that had been broken open and remade. When a fellow student lost someone they loved, Kai didn't quote passages about impermanence. Instead, he sat with them in their grief, his presence saying what words could not. I have been where you are. The darkness is real, but it is not the end of your story. Years passed. Kai became a master himself, but his teaching was unlike any other in the university. His classroom was known not for brilliant lectures, but for the quality of silence. He could create a space where students felt safe to bring their deepest questions, their rawest struggles. He would often begin his classes not with ancient texts, but with a simple question: what is breaking your heart today? And in the sharing that followed, wisdom would emerge not from books, but from the collision of one human experience with another. The other masters sometimes questioned his methods. Where are the formal teachings? They would ask. Where is the structured curriculum? Kai would smile a smile that held both sadness and joy, like sunlight after rain. I am teaching them the most important lesson of all, he would reply. That wisdom without compassion is just clever nose. That understanding without tenderness is just intellectual decoration. That all the knowledge in the world means nothing if it can't meet a human being in their moment of need and offer them hope. And so Kai learned what the mountain had been trying to teach him all along, that our deepest wounds become our greatest wisdom. Not because suffering is good, but because it cracks us open to truths we could never learn in safety. It teaches us empathy. It shows us our own strength. It connects us to every other person who has ever hurt and survived and found a way to help someone else through their own dark night. The scholar who had once sought wisdom in books had become wisdom itself, not through accumulating knowledge, but through being broken and choosing to let love fill the cracks. Perhaps you recognize something of yourself in Kai's story. Maybe you, too, have found that your carefully constructed understanding sometimes feels inadequate when life delivers its hardest lessons. If so, let me offer you this. Your pain is not a sign that you failed at wisdom. It's often the beginning of true wisdom, the kind that can only be learned through being human, through being vulnerable, through letting your heart break open wide enough to hold not just your own suffering, but the suffering of everyone who will ever need your understanding. Your scars are not evidence of your weakness. They are proof of your courage to keep loving in a world that sometimes breaks hearts. And perhaps that's the most profound wisdom of all. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Be gentle with yourself. Your journey toward wisdom is unfolding exactly as it should. Until we meet again on the Resilient Walk, be well.